Chapter 1. The Garden Party. It was a golden June afternoon in the village of Little Dithering, the sort of day that seemed borrowed from a postcard or a particularly vivid memory of England, as it ought to be sun-dappled and gently perfumed by summer blooms. The air held a soft warmth, not too hot to offend propriety, and a light breeze stirred the petals of the roses that lined the vicarage garden in heavy, nodding abundance. The occasion was the Vicarage Rose Garden Charity Tea, an annual event presided over with practised cheer by Mrs. Ada Draycott, wife of the Reverend Lionel Draycott, and guardian of local social calendars. The purpose of the gathering, at least in theory, was to raise funds for the slow and creaking restoration of the church roof. In practice, it was the village's unofficial mid-year social inspection, where feuds were politely updated, alliances subtly shifted, and gossip exchanged beneath the fragrant camouflage of trellised climbing roses and fine bone china. Small groups clustered beneath white parasols and wrought iron gazebos strewn with bunting. Tables covered in pale linen cloths bore proud. Displays of sponge cakes, seedless jam tarts, and pyramids of finger sandwiches, so delicately cut they looked like something a doll might eat. Along the garden path, prize roses bloomed in confident succession. Dusky pink compassion, ivory glamis castle, the dramatic red of crimson glory. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath one such parasol, her knitting resting in her lap. She wore a dove gray summer dress with a neat collar and a straw hat that had seen many such village functions, though a new ribbon blue with a faint sheen gave it a fresh air. Her eyes, the clear pale blue of faded forget-me-nots, scanned the scene not with idle curiosity, but with the patient, unobtrusive interest of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the quiet dramas of human nature unfold in just such surroundings. Extraordinary turnout this year, commented Mrs. Weatherby, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple. She was a woman of formidable size and strong opinions, both of which she wielded with equal confidence. Though I dare say half of them are only here to see what Lady Redfern will wear. As if summoned, Lady Amelia Redfern appeared at that very moment, gliding across the lawn with a grace that seemed to displace air itself. She wore a wide-legged silk trouser suit in pearl gray, the sort of garment that would have caused a riot in the Women's Institute. Her auburn hair, coiled in a chignon at the nape of her neck, gleamed in the sun. A string of real pearls lay like a gentle smile against her collarbone. I'm told she brought the pearls back from Lucerne, Mrs. Weatherby added, lowering her voice and leaning in toward Miss Marple. Inherited them, supposedly. But no, one can quite remember who from. Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and adjusted her teacup. It was a skill she had long perfected, encouraging conversation without inviting scrutiny. Her husband died abroad, didn't he? Asked Miss Marple mildly. Yes, last winter, while they were skiing. Broke his neck on the slopes, very sudden. Heartbreaking. Mrs. Weatherby didn't sound especially heartbroken, and quite a bit younger than she was, you know. Poor man. Across the garden, Lady Redfern smiled politely as the local councillor said something about allotment policies, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that Miss Marple noticed. Not grief precisely, but something tucked away behind long lashes. Self-protection, perhaps, or calculation. "You know," Mrs. Weatherby continued, warming to her subject, "they say she's made inquiries about having the old red fern summer cottage renovated. It's been empty for years ever since the business with that nephew. And the garden boy, though that's another story." Miss Marple raised one eyebrow, the faintest motion, but she didn't press. She merely sipped her tea and allowed the breeze and the conversation to drift past Dot by a stand of rhododendrons. Colonel Arthur Withers, resplendent in his regimental tie and straw boater, was delivering a solemn pronouncement on the importance of sharp pruning shears to a politely trapped Mr. Giles Barton, solicitor and long-time resident of the village. Barton, slim, balding, with a habit of adjusting his spectacles even when they did not require it, seemed both amused and irritated. His lips moved with a smile, but the look in his eyes was sharper than it needed to be. "I told young Ellis not to waste time contesting the will," he was overheard saying. "If his aunt wanted the money to go to her poodle's trust, there's not a blessed thing he can do about it. That sort of nonsense should be illegal," Colonel Withers barked. "A blasted dog trust," Mr. Barton chuckled, the sound dry as kindling. "Where there's a will, there's family squabbling." A few feet away, Alice, the Redferns' new maid, barely 17 and prone to nervous glances, was laying out another tray of sandwiches. Her hands trembled slightly. As she passed Miss Marple's table, a saucer clattered against the edge of the tray. She apologized quickly, voice breathless, and hurried off toward the arbor. "She's new," said Mrs. Weatherby, watching the girl's retreating form. "Hardly trained and skittish as a rabbit. Amelia should have asked me for a reference. I know all the girls in the district." Miss Marple nodded, eyes lingering briefly on Alice's retreating figure. "She looks rather frightened. Of what, I wonder?" Mrs. Weatherby asked. Miss Marple didn't answer. The judging of the cakes was about to commence. Colonel Withers had been persuaded to lend his military eye to the sponge assessments, and Mrs. Draycott stood ready with her clipboard. There was a polite round of applause as the colonel cleared his throat, knife poised above a strawberry Victoria sponge with decisive intent. Then it happened. A scream high, sudden and piercing, cut through the laughter and pleasantries like a blade. The garden stilled. The sound had come from the far end of the rose walk, near the wall that marked the boundary between the vicarage garden and the long disused orchard once belonging to the Redfern estate. Chairs scraped. Someone dropped a plate. Alice stood near. The arbor, pale as milk, one gloved hand pressed hard to her mouth. There, crumpled at the base of the arbor, beneath a cascade of soft pink roses, lay Mr. Giles Barton. His eyes were open but unseeing, one lens of his spectacles cracked like a spider's web. His cream waistcoat bore a grotesque bloom of blood that spread slowly into the white linen. Miss Marple was on her feet almost before the others had risen. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. "Good heavens!" Colonel Withers lumbered forward, followed by Mrs. Draycott's nephew, young Peter, and a few of the braver tea-goers. "Stand back. Give the man air," the colonel ordered, though the advice was clearly too late. Miss Marple approached the body carefully. She did not touch him, she never did, but her eyes moved with calm precision over the details. The loosened bow tie, the broken spectacle lens, the faint scent of rose petals mingled with something more metallic. The crushed remains of a pink rose lay beneath Barton's hand, its petals stained dark. "Dear me," she murmured. Lady Redfern arrived at the scene. Moments later, her composure faltering for the first time. She stared at the body, lips parted. "Is he dead?" she whispered. Colonel Withers gave a curt nod. "Stabbed. Looks like a small blade, sharp. No sign of a struggle must have come from behind." Whispers rippled through the garden like wind through tall grass. Who would do such a thing? It was so sudden. "I was just talking to him." Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze drifting not to the body now, but to the people gathered around it, their faces, their movements, the reflexive way they formed opinions and alibis in the same breath. And Alice, still standing apart, eyes, wide fists clenched at her sides. Poor Mr. Barton had never been well liked. He had a talent for knowing things he oughtn't, and a tendency to let it be known. But murder and little dithering murder at the vicarage garden party, no less, was something else entirely. Miss Marple bent slightly and studied the crushed rose again. A single petal stuck to Barton's cufflink. "A pity," she said softly, "but I rather think this wasn't entirely unexpected. At least not by everyone." She looked up as the local constable arrived, flustered and red-faced, and though no one noticed it then, Miss Marple's eyes had already begun to gather threads from the scene, weaving them gently, invisibly, into a tapestry of truth. Chapter 2. The village reacts the following morning. Little Dithering awoke to the peculiar stillness that comes after a storm, not the kind that topples trees or floods cellars, but the quieter, more unsettling kind that overturns lives. Word of Mr. Giles Barton's death had already traveled faster than the morning milk delivery. By 7 o'clock, every kettle in the village was whistling with urgency, every breakfast table laid with equal parts toast and speculation dot at the High Street post office. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, leaned halfway out her window to inform Mr. Beckett, the grocer, that the police had sealed off the vicarage garden and were interviewing guests. At the bakery, Doris Temple passed the news along with her sourdough. Eyebrows raised to scandalous heights. By midday, the murder was no longer a tragedy, but a community event, and every villager, from the laundry girl to the retired naval captain, had an opinion on the matter. "It must have been someone from outside," declared Mrs. Larch at the greengrocer's, brushing flour from her sleeve with a dramatic flair. "No one from here would do such a thing. We're not that sort of village." "Speak for yourself," muttered old Ben Hargreaves, polishing apples into unnatural shine. "He knew everyone's business, Martin did. Always sniffing around things best left buried." "He was an unpleasant man," admitted Mr. Ellery from behind his newsagent counter. "But unpleasantness isn't a reason for murder. At least, not most days." In the parlor of the vicarage, the air was thick with stale lavender polish and silent worry. Mrs. Draycott sat upright on the edge of her chair, hands twisted in her lap like a knotted length of ribbon. Her face, usually flushed with the healthy red of village contentment, had faded to a blotchy pink. "It's simply dreadful." "Jane," she whispered, as Miss Marple stirred her tea with thoughtful precision, "to think dead on my roses." "I'm quite sure the roses will recover," Miss Marple replied gently, not unsympathetic. "And so in time will the village." Mrs. Draycott made a strangled sound of agreement. "And the gossip, it's already started. Colonel Withers told me this morning that Barton had enemies." "Enemies? In Little Dithering?" Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She was watching the rain-speckled window, her mind walking its quiet paths. "In my experience," she said after a moment, "most people have enemies. Some just disguise them better than others." She sipped her tea. Giles Barton made a career of secrets, and secrets are rarely fond of daylight. Outside, a black motor car pulled up along the vicarage gate. Two figures emerged, one in a plain brown overcoat and bowler hat, the other in uniform. Superintendent Harold Bixby, who had come up from Milchester, was known for his blunt efficiency and dislike of interference, especially the amateur sort. Miss Marple, however, had never considered herself an amateur, merely a student of human behavior. The constable knocked twice. Moments later, Superintendent Bixby was ushered into the study by the Reverend Draycote, who looked as though he'd aged 5 years overnight. Miss Marple could hear the low tones of official conversation drift down the hall, punctuated now and then by the superintendent's clipped vowels. "I imagine he'll want to speak to everyone who was present," said Miss Marple, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "Best to let him do his work. Do you think it's someone local?" Mrs. Draycote asked, then paled further. "Jane, do you think it's someone we know?" Miss Marple gave her a calm, level look. "My dear Ada," she said gently, "it is always someone we know." By late afternoon, the police had taken statements from nearly every guest. The interviews were conducted at the parish hall, where folding chairs, a chipped teapot, and a single constable with a clipboard created the illusion of process. Miss Marple, when her turn came, was polite and precise. She answered every question, offered no theories, and made no mention of her observations. Superintendent Bixby barely looked up from his notes. "You say you didn't see Mr. Barton immediately before the incident?" he asked. "No, Superintendent," Miss Marple said. "I last saw him speaking with Colonel Withers near the rhododendrons, about 10 minutes before it happened." "And you noticed anything unusual in his manner?" "Only that he seemed amused," she replied, "and perhaps slightly triumphant, as though he had just said something rather clever, and didn't mind who knew it." Bixby frowned, but said nothing. After a few more cursory questions, he dismissed her with a nod. Miss Marple exited the hall into the growing hush of evening. The air had cooled, and the roses in the vicarage garden, now behind police tape, sagged slightly under the weight of the day. She paused at the edge of the green, watching as Alice, the maid, hurried past with her eyes on the ground. The girl's posture was tight with tension, her steps clipped and silent. She looked as though she hadn't slept. At the baker's across the street, Mrs. Temple was already serving theories with her shortbread. "They say Barton had documents," she whispered to Mr. Partridge, the clockmaker. "Blackmail, some think. Amelia Redfern was the last to speak with him, you know, and she's far too calm, or perhaps far too used to grief," Miss Marple murmured aloud, though no one was near enough to hear. She continued down the lane toward her cottage, passing the edge of the Redfern property. The gate was latched, the garden behind it wild with neglect, but the front windows glowed with golden lamplight. A tall shadow passed behind the curtain. Amelia Redfern was home. Miss Marple paused, looking up at the windows. Something unspoken hovered at the edge of her thoughts, a connection not yet formed, a thread still slack. Inside, a faint chord of piano music drifted into the evening air. Debussy. she thought, with a touch too much force in the fingering dot. An odd choice for morning dot, she resumed walking. That evening, over a modest supper of soup and toast, Miss Marple reviewed the day in her notebook. She wrote nothing of speculation, only facts, names, and TIMINGS. She had listed Giles Barton seen with Colonel Withers, 4:15 p.m., Lady Redfern, nearby, possibly speaking with Alice, maid. Shortly before 4:25 p.m., Barton's body, discovered by Alice at approximately 4:30 p.m., rose beneath hand, crushed, but stem intact, suggests fall. Not scuffle. No weapon recovered. No one reported hearing a cry before Alice's scream. She tapped her pencil against the page. The murderer had not only acted swiftly, but cleanly. One decisive thrust. No flailing, no mess. That spoke of purpose and practice, or perhaps cold, sudden rage. Miss Marple looked out at the twilight garden, the shadows of roses stretching long across the earth. In the near distance she could hear the church bell strike 9 in Little Dithering. People were beginning to lock their doors. Suspicion had settled over the village like fog. She closed her notebook and folded her hands in her lap. Tomorrow, no doubt there would be questions, more interviews, and likely a suspect, someone obvious, someone convenient. But Jane Marple had learned long ago that in villages like hers, convenience was a very poor guide to the truth. And as she turned out the lamp, she knew quietly, certainly, that the game had only just begun. Chapter 3. Early investigation. The morning after the interviews, the parish hall had been returned to its usual duties, hosting a knitting circle and a notice board thick with curling announcements. But just beyond, inside the vicarage study, Superintendent Harold Bixby stood frowning over a layout of photographs and notes pinned to a makeshift incident board. Beside him, Constable Greaves, young, earnest, and not particularly sharp, read aloud from his scribbled notebook. No signs of forced entry, sir. No sign of a struggle. Statement from Colonel Withers confirms Barton was last seen alive at 4:20 p.m. Body discovered by Alice Hammond. Redfern household maid at approximately 4:30. No one heard anything, no shout, no cry. No murder weapon, Bixby muttered. No motive that sticks. And too many people who say they saw nothing. Typical village omerta. He paced once across the vicar's study, casting a glance at the case summary. A dead solicitor at a rose garden party was hardly what he'd expected when assigned to a domestic incident in a sleepy backwater. And yet here they were 20. Guests, one corpse, and a storm of supposition. He hated suppositions. What about the Redfern woman? He asked suddenly. Lady Amelia. Constable Greaves cleared his throat. She says she was speaking with Mr. Partridge near the rose arbor, just before the scream. Said she didn't see Barton after cake judging. Mr. Partridge confirmed. Did she seem rattled? Greaves hesitated. No, sir. Calm. Polite. Maybe too calm. Bixby grunted. Widows usually are. He turned to the window where the vicarage roses, now dulled by the heat, drooped toward the lawn. He couldn't help but imagine the scene. Barton walking alone. Down the rose walk, back turned. A quiet footfall. One precise motion. Blood blooming on linen. No time to scream. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, Bixby muttered. Or they got very, very lucky. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat at her parlor window with her embroidery hoop, seemingly engrossed in the satin-stitch edge of a lily. Yet her eyes remained fixed on the small path that wound past her cottage toward the high streets, specifically the people who used it, and more importantly, the ones who didn't. Lady Amelia Redfern had not appeared that morning, not even for her usual stroll through the village square, nor had Alice, the young maid. Rumors were already forming in the minds of those inclined toward suspicion. "Too quiet," Miss Marple murmured, adjusting her thread. "A kind of absence that speaks louder than presence." At 10:15, the post arrived a dull thud against the doormat. She retrieved it, flicking past a gardening catalogue and an invitation to a church flower rota, when a square envelope, cream-colored and faintly scented, caught her eye dot. It was from Florence Litchfield, her second cousin's daughter in Maidenhead. Enclosed was a letter detailing local scandal in generous terms. Florence had always been enthusiastic, but one line in particular gave Miss Marple pause. "Can you imagine someone tried to contest Aunt Dora's will by claiming Giles Barton had misplaced the papers? Absolute nonsense, of course, but he made himself enemies in the process." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her teacup dot. So Barton had been meddling with wills outside of Little Dithering as well. That lent weight to something she'd already begun to suspect. The solicitor had a habit of collecting power in the most subtle of ways, not through aggression, but through the careful curation of secrets. And when one makes a profession of secrets, it's only a matter of time before someone resents being held to account. Later that day, a light drizzle began to fall, casting the village in a silvery gloom. Miss Marple, undeterred, slipped on her mackintosh and made her way to the grocer's. Inside, she found Mrs. Larch browsing tins with deliberate slowness, clearly waiting for an audience. "Oh, Jane," she said, loud enough for the shop boy to hear. "You wouldn't believe what I've just heard." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows with a pleasant smile. "Do tell." "They say Barton had a file locked away in his desk marked private. Locked, Jane, and he kept the only key on a chain round his neck like some kind of dragon guarding treasure." "How intriguing." "More than that. I heard from Mrs. Temple's niece, she cleans the solicitor's office on Wednesdays, that he was in a dreadful mood last Thursday. Said someone was going to regret crossing him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did he mention whom he was referring to?" "Not by name, but that same day Amelia Redfern was seen entering his office, just after hours." Miss Marple let her eyes widen just slightly. "Really, what a coincidence." Mrs. Larch leaned closer. "There's more. Barton had been sniffing around old Gerald Redfern's will. Amelia inherited everything, you know. And Barton, he was Gerald's solicitor. Do you think it's possible he found something?" Miss Marple tapped her shopping list against her basket, her tone as mild as buttered toast. "If there was anything amiss in the will, I suppose Barton would have handled it privately. But some men do enjoy making people squirm." As she left the shop, rain slicking the cobbles beneath her sensible shoes, Miss Marple turned the thought over in her mind. If Amelia Redfern had visited Barton late, in secret, then it was likely not to seek legal counsel. That could have been done by letter. No such a meeting suggested confrontation, and perhaps blackmail? But Amelia was too composed. Miss Marple had met enough widows to know the signs of true distress. Lady Redfern's control was immaculate-like, a pianist playing only the notes she wished others to hear, which meant either guilt or long practice. She would need to visit her. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a social call to the Redfern cottage. The door was opened by Alice, who looked pale and drawn, her apron damp at the corners. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, startled. "Lady Redfern is resting. I only wanted to offer my condolences." "A dreadful thing? What happened?" "I thought perhaps a little company might be welcome." Alice hesitated, then stepped aside. Lady Amelia sat in a high-backed armchair by the fireplace, a book open but unread in her lap. Her eyes lifted, calm and unreadable. "Miss Marple, how kind of you." "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said gently, lowering herself into a delicate occasional chair. "I know how exhausting these kinds of days can be. One has barely processed the shock before people come asking questions." Lady Amelia gave a faint, dry smile. "Questions seem inevitable when a man is murdered under your roses." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and yet sometimes it's the silences that speak most." Lady Amelia's gaze sharpened, but she said nothing. "I remember Giles Barton when he was quite young," Miss Marple continued. "A clever boy. Always had a way of making you feel as though he knew something you didn't." "He was intrusive?" Amelia said. "He enjoyed making people uncomfortable. He liked control." Miss Marple nodded, her tone casual. "And you saw him the day he died?" "Only briefly," Lady Amelia replied. "He was circling the rose beds. I passed him, but we didn't speak. He looked preoccupied." "And afterwards?" "I was with Mr. Partridge. We were discussing clock repairs." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I've always found time-keeping very useful in such matters." There was a flicker, then a pause too slight for most to notice. Lady Amelia smoothed her skirt. Her fingers were steady. Dot. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you, dear. I won't intrude further. I expect you'll have many more visitors, soon official and otherwise." Outside the rain had stopped, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. Miss Marple walked slowly, thinking. Barton had held secrets. Amelia had reason to protect hers. Alice had stumbled on the scene, and yet her fear seemed deeper than simple shock. No one had seen the murder, but someone had known where Barton would be, and when Dot and someone, perhaps more than one, was lying. Miss Marple returned home, her mind whirring like the gears of one of Mr. Partridge's clocks. Tomorrow would bring new suspects, new lies, and if she was not mistaken, a very telling clue. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By the third day, Superintendent Bixby had identified a suspect, and more importantly, a motive. It was a tidy conclusion, the kind he liked best. Unfortunately for the truth, tidy conclusions were often the most dangerous kind. The suspect was young Alice Hammond, the maid in Lady Redfern's household, and the first to discover Mr. Barton's body. Too young to be clever, too nervous to be composed. To Bixby's mind, she was exactly the sort of person who made a fatal mistake and then panicked. She had means, motive, and opportunity, he told Constable Greaves as they stood behind. The cordon in the vicarage garden, the faint scent of trampled rose petals still lingering in the air. She knew where Barton was walking. She could have followed him. A quick strike with a concealed blade, panic, then scream. Textbook. Motive. "Sir, she'd been seen arguing with him," Bixby said. according to Mrs. Weatherby's gardener. Something about a reference threatening to report her for theft, apparently, might have cost her her position. Constable Greaves hesitated. But would a girl like that really stab someone? Bixby gave a snort. Desperation, Greaves. A girl like that, no family, no prospects, gets accused of theft, she panics, strikes out, then screams. To Bixby it fit like a neat jigsaw, and he liked puzzles that completed themselves. When word of Alice's arrest reached Miss Marple the next morning, delivered via a flustered Mrs. Draycott, carrying a tray of leftover carrot buns, she paused only briefly in her stitching. "Alice?" she said quietly. "No, I don't think so." "But the police seem quite sure," Mrs. Draycott whispered. "They say she was crying when they took her in, and she had no proper alibi." "Crying proves very little," Miss Marple replied. "I've seen people cry at the loss of a cat and not shed a tear at their own mother's funeral." She folded her needlework gently. "Besides," she continued, "if I were to murder someone, and I hasten to say I wouldn't, I rather think I would avoid doing it in a garden crowded with half the parish, especially while wearing a starched uniform and gloves." Mrs. Draycott blinked. "Gloves?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Why, yes. Alice was wearing gloves when she carried the tea-tray. Linen, good ones. Very proper for the occasion." Mrs. Draycott considered this, her brow furrowed like an unopened fan. "But what does that mean?" Miss Marple rose from her chair. "Only that gloves tend to be left behind when one commits murder in haste. Yet hers were on her hands when she screamed. Still starched, still clean." Mrs. Draycott's mouth opened, then closed. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring pat on the hand. "Never fear, Ada. I suspect the truth will be found elsewhere, perhaps even among the gentlemen." Meanwhile, in the tap-room of the Hare and Hen, Colonel Withers was holding court. A small but attentive audience had gathered, including Mr. Partridge the clockmaker and young Peter Draycott, who looked uncomfortable in the smoky air. With all respect to the police, the colonel was saying, puffing on his pipe, "They're barking up the wrong tree. That girl wouldn't know one end of a blade from the other." "Then who did, Colonel?" Peter asked. "Someone must have done it." Withers's eyes narrowed. "Barton made enemies. You ask me, Lady Redfern had the most to lose. You've heard the talk he'd been sniffing around her late husband's affairs. A man like Barton doesn't do that for sport. He wanted something." Partridge stirred his bite. "But would she risk everything? Her status, her name?" "I've seen it before," Withers said. "War changes people. You hold on to what you've got fiercely, and she's not one for weakness, that one." Cold eyes. Mr. Partridge said nothing, but his hand twitched slightly around the glass. Peter shifted in his seat. "And what about you, Colonel? You were the last to speak to Barton." Withers stiffened. "What of it?" Peter looked down. "Nothing. Just wondered what you talked about." There was a long pause. Withers exhaled. "Roses, boy. We talked about pruning roses." That evening Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reviewing her notes. Again, the pages were now marked with columns. Names, times, conversations, silences. 3 suspects stood out not for what they had done, but for what they had not done. Alice Hammond gives no blood. No visible panic during tea service gives gloves. Clean, starched gives trembling, but possibly frightened before the murder lady Amelia Redfern gives calm demeanor. unshaken during interviews, gives visited Barton privately days before death, gives Barton had legal knowledge of late husband's estate, gives possible financial manipulation. Colonel Arthur Withers gives seen speaking to Barton shortly before death, gives no confirmed witness for whereabouts between 4:20 to 4:30, gives ex-military likely skilled with weapons, gives deeply traditional, possibly resented Barton's new wish, paused over Withers's name. He was blustering, yes, but that could be performance, and his reputation as a man of honor could just as easily conceal old wounds or newer grievances. But it was Partridge, the clockmaker, who intrigued her most. Mr. Jonathan Partridge gives alibi confirmed by Amelia, gives clockmaker precise, methodical, gives known to Barton through estate work, gives said very little. Since the incident he had the skill to act with subtlety, the temperament to remain unnoticed, and most curiously he had not once in 3 days asked a single question about the murder. In Miss Marple's experience, that kind of restraint usually meant one of two things, guilt or knowledge, and those, of course, were sometimes the same thing. The next morning, Superintendent Bixby requested Miss Marple's company in the vicarage garden, not for consultation, he said, but a fresh pair of eyes. The crime scene had been reopened. The area where Barton had fallen was now bordered by a ring of string and small wooden markers. The arbor remained, its rose vines a little trampled, but fragrant still. He fell here, Bixby said, pointing with a cane. Face forward, one blow, no sign of struggle. Was anything missing? Miss Marple asked. Not that we can tell. He had his watch, wallet, spectacles. And the key? Bixby blinked. What key? The key to his private file drawer, she said. The one he always wore on a chain round his neck. He stared at her. There wasn't any key. Miss Marple murmured. The net is very interesting. She bent over the arbor, examining the flattened rose stems. And these were crushed underfoot? Yes. She looked back toward the path. No blood splatter on the walkway. The wound must have bled downward, not outward. Bixby frowned. You sound like a detective, Miss Marple. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it, she said, eyes twinkling. I'm merely fond of gardens. They tell you so much, especially when something's been trampled that shouldn't have. She straightened. Someone stood here for a time, just here, after the murder. Not fleeing, but searching. Bixby looked confused. For what? Miss Marple gave him a small, secret smile. For the key, of course. The pieces were beginning to shift now. Alice had been arrested, but too early, too neatly. Someone had wanted her to be seen, but the real killer, Miss Marple suspected, had no interest in being seen at all. And next, she would follow the threads of a conversation, not yet had one that would begin, perhaps with clocks. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. The sun returned to Little, dithering with unseasonable brilliance on the 4th morning after the murder, casting cheerful light on a village steeped in quiet unease. The roses in the vicarage garden had begun to recover from their trampling, but the air still held the tang of suspicion, soft and lingering, like a perfume no one could name. Miss Marple, for her part, had decided to visit Mr. Jonathan Partridge. His shop. Partridge's timepieces and repairs sat between the haberdashery and the bank, its front window displaying a row of grandfather clocks and brass carriage timepieces all ticking with muted dignity. A small hand-painted sign read, "Ring once, not twice." She obeyed the instruction, and moments later Mr. Partridge himself emerged from the back room. A lean, thoughtful man with careful fingers and gray at his temples. He blinked at her with mild surprise. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. How can I assist you?" "Oh, Mr. Partridge, I'm not here on business." "Not exactly," she said with a warm smile. "I was hoping you might help me understand something about mechanisms." He gestured toward the back room. "Please do come in." The workshop smelled of oil and old wood. Gears, screws, and magnifying lenses lay in tidy rows across the bench. On one wall a cuckoo clock struck 10, and a small wooden bird lurched forward and chirped its time. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. "You know, I've always been fascinated by clocks," she said. "Each one so precise, so full of intention. But what interests me most is the way they stop." Mr. Partridge gave a faint smile. "Stop?" "Yes, not from accident, but interference. Sabotage, even. I wonder, would someone trained in clock repair notice such a thing if it occurred in, say, a person's daily routine?" Mr. Partridge's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I suppose it depends," he said slowly. "On whether one was watching." Miss Marple nodded. "And were you, Mr. Partridge, watching Mr. Barton?" He didn't answer at once. His fingers moved to straighten a small screwdriver, aligning it precisely with the edge of a cloth. "I was near the arbor," he said eventually. "Lady Redfern and I had just finished discussing the mantel clock in her drawing-room. I recall hearing Barton's voice further up the path. He was speaking to someone. To whom? I couldn't see. I assumed it was Colonel Withers. And then? Then I heard nothing more, until the scream." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Memory is such a delicate thing, Mr. Partridge. I find it tells the truth, just not always the whole of it." She rose, offering him a gentle look. "Thank you. That was most helpful." As she stepped out into the street, her eyes narrowed slightly. His recounting was calm rehearsed, but it was not what he had said that interested her most, Dot. It was what he had failed to say. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage garden, now dry and sun-dappled. Once more, the police tape had been removed, the arbor no longer a crime scene but a garden structure again, though one whose beauty had been irreversibly tainted by memory. She moved quietly to the spot where Mr. Barton had fallen and knelt, not on the rose beds, but beside a narrow line of gravel bordering the main path. There it was, the detail, a fragment nearly missed, a small shard of glass, half buried in soil. She picked it up carefully. No more than an inch wide, it gleamed faintly in the light, curved, smooth on one edge, jagged on the other. A lens, not from Barton's. Spectacles, those had been intact, save for one spidered crack. This was different, thicker. A monocle, perhaps? No, too small, too precise. She reached into her bag and retrieved the list of guests and their known accessories, drawn from a helpful conversation with Mrs. Draycott and her flower committee memory. Only one man had worn a loop. Mr. Partridge. Miss Marple stared down at the glass between her fingers, its curve catching the light like a wink. That evening she returned home just as the sun dipped behind the spire of St. Mildred's. A letter was waiting in her post-box, no return address, but the paper was thick and fine, Inside was a single note. He had no right to it. I only meant to scare him. He laughed. No name, no signature, but something about the handwriting struck her angular and exacting, like someone used to measured lines or blueprints. She tucked the note away and brewed herself a cup of tea, her mind churning gently like a windmill in slow-motion dot. So the murderer had intended a threat. The knife, or perhaps the confrontation, wasn't meant to be fatal. Not originally. But something had changed. A laugh? That made sense. Barton was a man who delighted in pressure, who wielded knowledge like a scalpel. If he'd found something about a will, a secret, an affair, and used it to amuse himself at someone else's expense, yes, that could provoke a sudden, irreversible act. But who? At twilight, Miss Marple walked the path again, retracing each movement between the tea tables and the arbor. The rose garden had quieted. Birds sang from hedges. Insects hummed beneath the leaves, all of it innocent and lovely and indifferent. She paused by a low trellis near the arbor, where a few small smudges of dried mud marked the lattice. Unusual for this part of the garden. Guests hadn't walked there, but someone had. She stooped. Just beneath the trellis, partly hidden beneath a rose bush's lower branches, she spotted a glint of metal. Carefully she reached in and retrieved it. A chain, delicate, silver, with a broken clasp dot at its end. A small, old-fashioned key, the kind that opened narrow drawers in private desks. Miss Marple stood motionless for a long moment, the weight of the key in her palm. Surprisingly heavy. So that's where it had gone. Not lost during the attack. Hidden. Which meant the killer hadn't panicked at all. They'd acted with care, then taken the time to remove the key after Barton fell and hidden it deliberately, knowing the garden would be searched, hoping perhaps to retrieve it later, or to ensure its discovery would implicate someone else. And now that key sat in Miss Marple's hand. She slid it gently into her handbag. Later, as the sun dropped low over the village rooftops, Miss Marple wrote a new entry in her notebook. Shard of loop found near seen Mr. Partridge, evasive nut, precise, rational tone. Possible remorse? Barton laughed at someone. That laughter was the spark. Hidden key equals premeditation or delayed panic. Suggests calm mind. The pieces were forming, now still loose, but no longer shapeless. In Miss Marple's experience, where there was a hidden key, there was usually a locked drawer, and inside that drawer, a truth someone was very, very desperate to keep silent. Chapter 6. Confrontations and secrets rain fell the next morning, not the soft sort that nourishes gardens, but a steady gray drizzle that turned the high street into a reflective ribbon of gloom. Windows fogged, shopkeepers lit their stoves early, and umbrellas sprouted like mushrooms from cottage doors. Miss Marple did not take her usual walk. Instead, she prepared a plate of honey biscuits, tucked it beneath a linen napkin, and made her way to the Redfern cottage. Rain tapped politely on her umbrella as she walked, as though even the weather was curious to know what she'd found in the garden the night before. Lady Amelia opened the door herself. She was dressed plainly, charcoal skirt, white blouse, and no pearls this time. Her eyes were shadowed, not from grief, but from weariness of the social kind. Miss Marple. I didn't expect. I hope I'm not intruding, Jane said gently, holding out the plate. I thought you might like something with tea. Rainy days do call for a bit of sweetness. There was a moment's hesitation, just enough to suggest calculation, but then Lady Amelia stepped aside. The drawing-room was sparsely decorated. A few heirloom pieces, a modest upright piano, and a large painting above the hearth that showed. The late Gerald Redfern as a young officer, his eyes gazing past the viewer with uncomfortable intensity. "You knew him well?" Miss Marple asked as she sat, motioning toward the portrait. "Not really," Amelia said, pouring tea. "We married late. I was his second attempt at domesticity. He was charming, but restless. There were things he didn't talk about, and things I didn't ask. And now?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "You find yourself protecting his name?" "I find myself protecting what's left of my life," Amelia replied, more candid than expected. They sipped in silence. "You spoke to Mr. Barton not long before the garden party, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked at last. Amelia didn't flinch, but her grip on her teacup tightened fractionally. "Yes, I visited his office. He'd written to say there were irregularities in Gerald's financial records, that someone might contest the will. And was there? Possibly. I didn't ask many questions." Her tone had gone flat. "I signed what he told me to sign. I trusted him to handle it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You don't strike me as someone who trusts easily." Amelia's eyes flicked up. "No, not any more." "And did Mr. Barton threaten you?" A pause. "No," she said softly, "but he implied things that people might talk, that the cottage would go back to the estate, that perhaps I should consider being grateful for his discretion. I told him to keep whatever documents he liked. I wouldn't be bullied." Amelia's voice trembled just slightly. He laughed. The word hung in the room like a cold breath. Miss Marple gave her a long, kind look, then rose. "Thank you, dear. I won't take up more of your morning." At the door she paused. "Do let me know if your mantel clock needs looking at again. Mr. Partridge does such excellent work." Amelia gave her a strange, guarded smile. "Does he?" Miss Marple left in thought, the rain softening around her. She did not go home, but walked to Barton's office instead, which had remained sealed under police order, or rather the front door had. But Miss Marple had always believed it best to look where others hadn't. She circled the rear alley behind the solicitor's building, once used by delivery boys and now mostly forgotten. A narrow iron gate stood half-latched. Past it a small gravel yard, a coal chute, and a back entrance with a rusted handle. The police, it seemed, had been thorough, but only where they expected clues to reside. She pressed the gate. It creaked, but didn't resist. The yard bore the signs of recent rain, no footprints, but tucked beneath the sill, barely visible from the alley, was a single matchstick, clean, unused, and next to it a faint smudge oil or soot on the stone ledge. Someone had been here recently, perhaps trying to re-enter the building to retrieve something, or to ensure something stayed hidden. Later that day she visited Colonel Withers under the guise of delivering a forgotten umbrella from the garden party. He invited her in with the air of a man practiced in both hospitality and defense. "Well, Miss Marple," he said as he poured sherry, "what can I do for our village's most discreet detective?" She gave a soft chuckle. "I wouldn't call myself that." He sat stiffly, Everyone's buzzing about that maid. Personally, I think it's nonsense. Do you? She asked mildly. Even though she was found nearest the body? She was terrified, not murderous. There's a difference. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. And what about Mr. Barton? He made enemies. Withers grunted. Solicitors do, even among the regiment. He paused. I served with Gerald Redfern, he said finally, in North Africa. He was reckless, always had some scheme. After the war, he kept up with Barton. They were thick as thieves, in fact, really? Oh yes, there was some business with investments. Gerald fancied himself clever with money. Barton encouraged it. I told him it would catch up to him one day. And did it? Withers hesitated. He came to me for help. Wanted to move some funds quietly. I refused. Why? Because I suspected it was nonsense. Gerald never could keep his accounts clean. Barton may have known something. May have helped. Miss Marple sipped her sherry. And what would you have done, she asked softly, if Barton had tried? To make you look a fool? His jaw tightened. I don't take kindly to blackmail, Miss Marple. Neither does anyone, she replied, rising dot by the time dusk fell. Miss Marple sat once again at her table, reviewing the evidence. Secrets revealed. Amelia visited Barton under duress potential blackmail. Barton laughed. She left angry. Gerald Redfern, involved in shady financial dealings. Barton's files may have threatened more than Amelia. Colonel Withers refused Gerald's request. Possibly resented Barton's knowledge, but it was Mr. Partridge who remained. The most still. Too still. She remembered the shard of loop dot, and the way he described the scene, how he'd heard Barton speak, but never said what was said. Or to whom why had he been so careful? And why had he never once, not in any of their interactions, expressed the slightest curiosity about the hidden file Barton kept? Unless, of course, he already knew what was in it, and had a very good reason. For keeping it buried. Miss Marple reached for her notebook and circled 3 names. Amelia. Withers. Partridge. 3 people with secrets. 3 people Barton had known far too much about, and one of them had killed him. Chapter 7. Another twist. 2 days after the arrest of young Alice Hammond, and 2 days before the garden party would have quietly been forgotten, had it not ended in blood little dithering woke to news that stopped the village in its tracks. Jonathan Partridge was missing. It was the baker who first noticed. His shop clock, an elegant French carriage piece regularly serviced by Mr. Partridge, had failed to chime at 6, prompting a routine check. But when he knocked at the clockmaker's door just before 7, there was no answer. The front blinds remained drawn. The post from yesterday still sat undisturbed on the stoop. By 8:30, Constable Greaves had been summoned. He entered the shop with the spare key from the landlord and returned 10 minutes later, pale-faced and shaken. The shop was empty, but the back room told another story. On the clockmaker's bench sat a single object, a silver chain, coiled deliberately beside. A note, better silence than shame. There was no signature, no sign of struggle. No blood, no overturned tools, no sign of departure. Just absence and the chain. And with it, as silence louder than any scream. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was standing in the workroom doorway, eyes drifting over the details the constable had not quite understood. A broken timepiece lay on the bench, its casing opened, the movement half exposed. But that wasn't what caught her attention, Dot. It was the dust. Faint layer still settled over the shelves and tools, undisturbed except for one narrow groove along the left-hand cabinet door. A drawer had been opened. Recently, Dot, she pointed. Constable, has anyone looked inside that cabinet? Greaves blinked. I don't believe so, Miss Marple. Superintendent Bixby hasn't returned from Milchester yet. Miss Marple nodded. Then let's have a look, shall we? Greaves hesitated. Then, curiosity outweighing protocol, he stepped forward and gently opened the drawer. Inside lay several folded sheets of foolscap, their edges yellowed and brittle, tied together with a red ribbon dot. Miss Marple reached for them with her gloved hand and gently opened the top sheet. Dot. It was a will, Dot, an older one. Gerald Redfern's original will, dated some 4 years earlier than the document currently on record. And in it the name of the sole beneficiary was not Lady Amelia, Dot. It was Jonathan Partridge. Greaves let out a low whistle. So he was to inherit everything? Miss Marple nodded, her voice quiet, until something or someone persuaded Gerald Redfern to change his mind. She turned the next page. There, in Barton's unmistakable scrawl, was a marginal note, revoked as of March 12th, witnessed Barton, Redfern, and beneath it, client advised to destroy, did not comply. Miss Marple closed the file. Mr. Barton kept copies of everything, including secrets, and it appears Mr. Partridge was one of them. By early afternoon, the village was alive with whispers. Mrs. Weatherby, relaying the news from behind the post-office wicket, declared it a coward's exit. Mr. Beckett at the grocer's insisted Partridge had fled to the coast. Colonel Withers remained uncharacteristically silent, but in the parlor of the vicarage, Miss Marple sat across from Superintendent Bixby, who had returned in haste and now wore the harried expression of a man whose case had not only unraveled, but reassembled into something more complicated. I'll be the first to admit I dismissed him, Bixby muttered, rubbing his forehead. Partridge never struck me as emotional. Never imagined he'd bolt. Perhaps he didn't, Miss Marple said softly. Bixby looked up. You think he's dead? I think he's missing. And in this village people don't go missing. By accident. She leaned forward. Superintendent, have you considered why Barton retained that will? He frowned. To leverage it against Partridge, I suppose. Blackmail? Perhaps. But think about this. Gerald Redfern rewrote the will, removed Partridge, and Barton witnessed that change. Legally, Partridge had no claim, so why keep the old one? Miss Marple smiled. Because Barton had already promised him something. Or perhaps the two men were engaged in something else entirely. Fraud, perhaps. Investment manipulation. If Barton was holding the original will, it wasn't leverage. It was protection against exposure. Bixby shook his head. But then Partridge kills him? Possibly, or someone else does. Someone who discovered the will, or was afraid Partridge would use it. Bixby blinked. Lady Redfern? Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence was pointed. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, a visitor arrived. It was Alice Hammond. She looked thinner than before, shadows under her eyes, but her voice was steady. They released me this morning, she said. No charges. Just told me to stay local, as if I had anywhere else to go. Miss Marple invited her in, poured her tea, and waited. "I didn't do it," Alice said. "I know you know that, but I saw something. I didn't tell. The police." Miss Marple looked up gently. "What was it, dear?" "I saw Mr. Partridge the night before the garden party, in the orchard path. He was talking to Mr. Barton. It was getting dark. I was walking home from the vicarage. I didn't think it was important at the time." "Did they seem friendly?" "No, tense. Partridge said something like, 'You think I let you ruin me?' And Barton laughed. That sharp little laugh he had." Miss Marple nodded. "And did anyone else see them?" "I don't know, but—" Alice hesitated. Lady Redfern's piano was playing. "I could hear it through the hedge." Miss Marple leaned back, eyes drifting to the fire dot. So all three had been there, and Barton had laughed again. A second confrontation, not at the garden party, but before, which meant the murder was not a spontaneous act of rage, but something planned, considered, and perhaps not by the man now missing by midnight. Miss Marple had returned to her notes, where she wrote 3 quiet words underlined in steady pencil. Someone moved the key. Partridge had vanished, but he had not taken the file, had not retrieved the key, because perhaps he had not been the one to hide it. She turned back to the earlier note, the one left anonymously in her letterbox. Better silence than shame. The phrasing was precise, almost literary. Emotionally distant. A clockmaker's tone, or a widow's. Miss Marple folded the note and tucked it into her knitting basket. The truth, she suspected, had already shown its face once in a locked drawer, again in a garden trampled underfoot, and now in the silence that followed a second disappearance. One murder had rattled the village, but now something darker had crept in, the fear that someone else was lying, and someone else might yet die. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test 2 days after Jonathan Partridge's disappearance. Little Dithering had become a village taught with polite panic. Conversations at the butcher's were clipped. Garden gates were closed more firmly. And the women at St. Mildred's Flower Guild arranged their lily in tense silence, though no one admitted it. A second crime, implied or actual, had rattled the village more than the first. A murder was dreadful, yes, but a disappearance whispered of something worse. Unfinished business. Miss Marple, however, seemed unchanged. She still walked to the grocer's in the mornings, still read her devotional by the window each evening, and still knit steadily, as if the world might come right again if she just reached the end of the row. But inside her mind, every stitch corresponded to a suspicion, every pattern a plan. She knew the time had come, not for confrontation, not exactly, but for a kind of invitation, a soft, polite trap. And so she wrote 3 letters, one to Colonel Withers, inviting him to tea on Friday afternoon to discuss a matter of concern related to the vicarage garden, one to Lady Amelia Redfern, asking her to stop by for a private word about the late Mr. Barton's files, and one to Superintendent Bixby, requesting his quiet presence at the same time, if he could manage it in plain clothes, of course. She knew only one of them would flinch. On Friday, just after 4, Miss Marple's drawing-room was set for tea. The table was laid with her best blue and white china. A sponge cake sat neatly sliced, and her napkins had been pressed so crisply They could have served in church. Colonel Withers arrived first, punctual to the second. He was in his Sunday blazer and wore a badge on his lapel. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, accepting a cup of Darjeeling, "you said you had something unsettling." She smiled. "Only a few threads I hoped you might help me untangle." Next came Lady Amelia, dressed immaculately in dove gray, a string of pearls once again at her throat. "You said it was private," she said coolly, eyeing the colonel with wary interest. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "but I find some matters require a little company." They seated themselves. The air was polite, tense. "Now," Miss Marple said gently, "it seems likely that Mr. Barton was killed because of what he knew or what he kept hidden. Wouldn't you agree?" Neither guest replied immediately. She continued. "There was a document in old will. It named Mr. Partridge as Gerald Redfern's heir. That alone would be motive enough for many things, wouldn't it?" Lady Amelia blinked once, but her face remained still. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "Mr. Barton kept it, though he witnessed its revocation." Colonel Withers cleared his throat. "Blackmail, then? Typical, perhaps. But curious, isn't it, that Mr. Partridge never tried to use it, not publicly, at least. He was quiet, methodical, perhaps not as ruthless as Mr. Barton assumed." She turned to Amelia. "And yet someone hid the key to that file." Amelia tilted her chin. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "No, dear. Merely observing." She folded her hands. "But what interests me most is what happened after the murder. Someone remained in the garden after the others ran. Someone searched Barton's body and took that key, then hid it, carefully, deliberately." Colonel Withers stiffened. "Well, that proves nothing. A criminal act, yes. But one done after the fact." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but only someone calm enough, someone accustomed to high-stress environments, would think clearly at such a moment. A soldier, perhaps." Withers's teacup clinked audibly against its saucer. "Now look here." Miss Marple held up a hand. "No accusations, Colonel. I merely find it curious that you were the last to speak to Barton, that you admitted as much, and that you've remained so quiet ever since." Withers opened his mouth, then closed it, but it was Lady Amelia who finally spoke. Her voice was even. "It wasn't Arthur," she said. Miss Marple looked at her. "No, no," Amelia repeated. "It was me." Withers turned sharply. "Amelia," she raised a hand. "I didn't stab him," she said, "but I did take the key." Miss Marple said nothing. "I saw him after the screen. I was one of the first there. No one noticed. Everyone was looking at the maid. I stepped closer. He was already dead, and I saw the chain." She swallowed. "I thought if he had anything on Gerald, I had to find it before someone else did. So I took the key, and I hid it. I didn't know what else to do." There was a long pause. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "Thank you for telling the truth." "Lady?" Amelia's voice trembled. "I thought it might protect Gerald's name. I didn't think Jonathan would disappear?" Miss Marple asked. Amelia nodded. Miss Marple reached into her pocket and retrieved the note. "Better silence than shame. I don't think Mr. Partridge killed Barton," she said quietly. "I believe he saw someone else do it, or arrived just after, and rather than face suspicion, he fled, or was made to disappear." She looked at both of them, And if he is dead, then the murderer has acted twice, which means they are desperate now, perhaps even dangerous. A knock came at the front door. Bixby stepped in silently from the back parlor, removing his hat. Amelia looked from face to face. "Then who?" Miss Marple folded her hands once more. "I believe I know, but I need one more thing." She turned to Colonel Withers. "Colonel, tell me, when you spoke to Barton that day, did you threaten him?" He hesitated, then straightened. "No. I warned him. He was pressing Gerald to name him in some investment scheme, one that might have implicated others. Barton had leverage over several men, including myself." He exhaled. "But I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said. "You didn't?" And her eyes shifted back to Lady Amelia, but she said nothing more. Not yet. She would let the next act unfold, not by accusation, but by behavior, because the true test of guilt, Miss Marple knew, was not what one confessed to Dot, it was what one could no longer pretend not to feel. Chapter 9. They revealed the drawing-room had fallen quiet. Colonel Withers shifted in his chair, his hands restless around the stem of his teacup. Lady Amelia sat poised, her spine straight, but her knuckles had gone white around the edge of her saucer. Superintendent Bixby stood behind them both, arms folded, face unreadable. Miss Marple placed her cup down gently and laced her fingers together in her lap. "It was never about Gerald Redfern's will," she said softly. "Not really. That was just the kindling." She paused, and no one spoke. "Mr. Partridge was once named as Gerald's heir. That much we know. And Barton, ever the opportunist, kept that information tucked away like an ace. But Mr. Partridge had no intention of challenging Lady Amelia's inheritance. He'd quietly accepted the revocation, and yet someone feared he wouldn't remain quiet." She looked to Lady Amelia, who did not flinch, but whose breathing had shifted. "Mr. Barton's files were threatening," Miss Marple continued, "but not just to you. They contained financial records that implicated Colonel Withers, possibly. Others in unwise or even illegal post-war investments orchestrated by Gerald Redfern. But Colonel Withers, I believe, confronted Barton honestly. He warned him off, but he didn't kill him." Withers's jaw tightened, but he gave a stiff nod. "So who did?" asked Bixby finally, his voice quiet. Miss Marple reached for her handbag and removed a small object, the silver key, still slightly tarnished, still bearing the faint trace of soil. "This key," she said, "was removed from Barton's neck after he was dead, hidden beneath the arbor. That act was not done in panic. It was a deliberate attempt to control the aftermath." She turned to Lady Amelia. "You were seen leaving the scene after the scream, moments before the crowd arrived. You reappeared from the side path near the orchard hedge. That gave you time to search Barton's body, take the key, and conceal it before anyone noticed." Amelia's lips parted, but she said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "I don't think you went to the garden that day planning to kill him. I think you hoped to confront him, perhaps bargain. You were losing your grasp over Gerald's estate. You'd come home to start again, but Barton threatened to undermine everything. He hinted, perhaps, that your marriage had never been entirely legal, that Gerald had debts, that you were never really Lady Redfern at all." Amelia's eyes flared. "That's not true. But he made you believe it could be. And then he laughed. That cutting, indifferent little laugh. The same one He gave Mr. Partridge the night before. Miss Marple folded her hands again. You found him alone by the arbor. You had the cake knife in your handbag, perhaps from helping Mrs. Draycott earlier. Or you took it from the tea-table unnoticed. You didn't plan it. But when he made his threat, when he mocked you, you struck. One clean, practiced motion, no second chance, no scream, only silence. Amelia said nothing, but the silence said enough. Colonel Withers turned to her, eyes wide. You? Her voice was steady when it came. I didn't intend to. He told me everything could be taken from me. That Gerald had left debts in my name, that the house wasn't legally mine, that I'd be publicly humiliated. I'd begged him not to release the documents. He said he looked forward to it. She looked at Miss Marple. He said I had the look of a woman who'd been pretending too long. And then he turned away from me. She inhaled sharply, voice low now, and I couldn't bear it. Superintendent Bixby stepped forward. Lady Amelia Redfern, I must caution you that anything you say may be taken down, and no need, she said. I know exactly what I've done. She stood slowly, composed even now. I'll pack a bag, she said, but Miss Marple gently placed a hand on her arm. There's no need, dear. They'll take care of that. Later, as the door closed behind the departing figures and the clatter of the motor car faded down the lane, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the roses sway gently in the breeze. Colonel Withers lingered a moment, hat in hand. You never mentioned the knife, he said quietly. Was there one? Miss Marple smiled faintly. There was. A carving knife found hidden behind a loose panel in the summer house near the orchard. But that wasn't the clue. What was? Her eyes twinkled. She was wearing gloves, she said. Linen, just like Alice, but hers were missing afterward. Only one pair unaccounted for. The kind worn by the hostess's helper, not the guest. Withers blinked. She'd handled the knife, then slipped the gloves away, but forgot no one ever saw her put them on again. Withers let out a low breath. And the key? She was too composed, Miss Marple said. Only someone trying to hide a reaction would be that calm. People in grief tremble. People in shock babble. But she was still, like a pond whose fish had long since sunk to the bottom. She sat, folded her hands, and reached once again for her knitting. I do hope someone sees to the roses, she murmured. It's such a shame to let them wilt after all that effort. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The arrest of Lady Amelia Redfern spread through Little Dithering with a curious mix of disbelief and inevitability. For days, villagers discussed it in low voices as if the very hedgerows might carry tailies to the wrong ears. They spoke of her poise, her silk trouser suits, her clipped vowels. Some said she had never quite fit in. Others recalled with sudden clarity moments when her charm had seemed rehearsed, her smiles too careful. Only a few remembered that. She had once returned to the village seeking quiet. Within a week, the Redfern cottage sat empty again. Curtains drawn, garden untended, the piano silent. A "For Let" notice was posted discreetly at the edge of the garden gate. Alice Hammond, quietly exonerated, returned to her duties, though this time in the vicarage household under Mrs. Draycott's watchful but kindly supervision. She was paler than before, older in some ways, but her hands no longer trembled. As for Mr. Jonathan Partridge, he returned, unharmed, though thin and hollow. Eyed Dot He had not fled, as many feared. He had gone to London, quietly and without fanfare, to consult a solicitor about Mr. Barton's papers, terrified that he would be implicated in a crime he had not committed. It was cowardice, he admitted later to Miss Marple, but not guilt. He reopened his shop 2 weeks after the affair, to quiet applause from the village. Miss Marple was his first customer. Her mantel clock had developed a slow tick, though neither of them mentioned it had worked perfectly the week before. Colonel Withers remained in the village, his reputation dented but intact. He retired quietly from the parish council and took up wood carving. Most assumed it was an act of dignity. Miss Marple suspected it was penance. Superintendent Bixby returned to Milchester with an unusual report light on physical evidence but heavy on motive, psychology, and a certain elderly spinster's irrefutable logic. It would not be the last time he found himself in Little Dithering. And the vicarage garden? It bloomed again. Under Mrs. Draycott's guidance, a new arbor was installed. Fewer roses, more hydrangeas. Something about their pale petals felt easier to look at. The charity garden party resumed the following summer, smaller, more subdued. No competition for cakes, no speeches, only tea and music. Miss Marple sat once more beneath the parasol with her knitting and her quiet smile. The village had turned a page, but not, she thought, a clean one, because people do not forget as quickly as they pretend to. And while Little Dithering was, by all appearances, much the same, it never truly would be again. That evening, as the sun poured gold over the garden walls, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a teacup in one hand, a soft wool shawl around her shoulders. A robin chirped from the window ledge. She gazed out at her own roses, blooming gently in the late light, their petals soft and unsuspecting. So many secrets, she murmured. So much pain hidden beneath good manners. She took a sip of tea, and all for the simple, impossible task of keeping one's place in the world. She reached for her knitting and began again, her needles clicking softly in the stillness. Outside, the village exhaled. Life went on. But Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and her unshakable sense of justice, would always listen a little closer, watch a little longer, and wait with gentle certainty for the truth to bloom, no matter how deeply it had been buried. The end. Whispers in the Rose Garden, a Miss Marple mystery.